Hello everybody and welcome to Daf Yomi. We are going to try our best to get through page 15, Daf Tesvav of Masechet Pesachim. It's going to be a bit of a toughie, but let's see what we can do. Let's try and work on this together. We're going to get the words for you up on the screen. Naturally, as I always seem to do, we're going to go first to the Mishnah that we're in the middle of, which is on yesterday's Daf Yud Daled. So let's try and go through this a little bit quickly, and then hopefully we'll be able to get a feel for what today's Gemara is talking about. So says the Mishnah as follows: Rabbi Chanina Sgan HaKohanim Omer. Rabbi Chanina, the assistant, the deputy Kohen, he says, Mimehem shel Kohanim lo nimne'u lisrok habasar shenitma bevlad hatuma im habasar shenitma ba'av hatuma. Okay, so he says that in all the days of the Kohanim, i.e., in all the time that he's been working in the Beis Hamikdash and beyond that as well, the Kohanim would not prevent themselves from burning basar, from burning meat that had been contaminated by Vlad Hatuma. What's a Vlad Hatuma? So there's different levels of Tuma. There's an Av Hatuma, which is the type of ritual impurity, Tuma, that could be contracted from things like dead bodies and things like that. And beneath that, there are other levels. There's a Rishon Latuma, a first degree of Tuma, a Sheni, which is a second degree, Shlishi, which is a third degree. So the point is that you've got Av Hatuma at the top and you've got Vlad Hatuma, which are subsequent levels of ritual contamination. So the point that Rabbi Chanina is making is as follows: that in all of his time, he saw that the Kohanim would burn meat that had been contaminated by a Vlad Hatuma, a lower level of Tuma, im habasar shenitma ba'av Hatuma, and they would not prevent themselves from burning it with meat that had become tamei from an Av Hatuma, a more primary source of Tuma. Even though by the two coming into contact, you would be adding and you would contaminating the Vlad Hatama, you would be contaminating the meat that's a derivative. Okay, so because it comes into contact with this more severe source of impurity, which is a problem because you're not supposed to add levels of impurity to things. So even though you'd be adding a level of impurity, they would still burn them together with Av Hatuma, things that have been contaminated at a higher level. Hosted Rabbi Akiva Ba'amar, Rabbi Akiva added onto this, and he added to the statement of Rabbi Chanina, Sgan HaKohanim, and he said, Mimehem shel Kohanim, in all of the days of the Kohanim, lo nimna'u milahadlik es hashemen shenifsal b'tavu yom b'ner shenitma b'tamei mes. Okay, so a similar concept over here. So in all the days of the Kohanim, they did not refrain from lighting oil, which was teruma oil, which was set aside and designated for use by the Kohanim. The trouble is that it was shenifsal b'tavul yom. It had come into contact with a tavul yom, somebody who was tamei at some point, but had gone to the mikvah and was now waiting for the end of the day so that they could get their official status of purity back. So they could go to the mikveh and have that contamination, that impurity taken away, but they would have to wait until nightfall to be able to be allowed to eat sacrificial meat once again. We actually encountered a Tavul Yom right the way back on the first very day of the Daf Yomi cycle, back in the first Mishnah of Brachot. We talked about somebody who has to wait for the end of the day to be able to eat sacrifices again. And so the point is this, that this is a low level of disqualification, because it hasn't actually come into contact with somebody who is ritually impure, just somebody who is waiting for their official status to be changed. So they would light this oil that had been invalidated in this way, and they would light it along with oil that could have become ritually impure by coming into contact with a corpse. Afalpi again, shemosifin tuma al tumaso. Even though it would be adding a level of impurity to the level of impurity that the oil already has. As we can see here in the notes, the person who is waiting for the day to end is actually a sheni l'tumah. They still have a remnant of this impurity, but only to a second degree, and then it's coming into contact with this oil, and so it's not supposed to be that way. And yet we see from this statement from Rabbi Akiva that they would still light this oil together. Amar Rabbi Meir. Now Rabbi Meir comes along and says, and that's where we're going to be picking up today's stuff. Amar Rabbi Meir, midivreihem, from their words, from their statements, lamadnu, we learn, shesorfin teruma tahora im hatamea ba'pesach. So from these words, from their words, we learn that you can burn teruma tahora, which is teruma, set aside, produce that is set aside for kohanim, which is pure, which is tahor, but chametz, so this is chametz of teruma, which is pure, and it would be burnt with teruma, which is impure, which is tameh. But because it's chametz, because we need to be getting rid of it on Pesach, it would be burnt together. Pure and impure could be burnt on Erev Pesach as part of the biur chametz, as part of the process of getting rid of your chametz. Amar Rabbi Yossi, eino hi hamida. Rabbi Yossi says this is not the same thing. This is not comparable. Meaning that we can't learn this concept of burning pure chametz with impure chametz from these cases that we've been hearing about from Rabbi Chanina and from Rabbi Akiva. Umodim Rabbi Eliezer, and then it goes on to say, we're going to be picking up on this as well. Umodim Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua agree, shesorfin zula atzma v'zula atzma, that when it comes to the chametz, pure chametz and impure chametz, each have to be burned separately. They agree to that fact. In which case the Mishnah asks, Amar nechlaku, so what do they disagree on? Al hataluya v'al hatamea. When you have chametz, which is potentially impure, there's a doubt around it, and on chametz, which is definitely impure. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, Tisarev zula atzma v'zula atzma. Rabbi Eliezer says they have to be burned separately. Rabbi Yehoshua Omer shtehin ka'achas. Rabbi Yehoshua says they can be burnt together. So that was the Mishnah that we're now going to be tackling today. So we're going to jump now to the bottom, towards the bottom of your Daled base. There's 2 dots, which are 6 lines up, and we are quoting the Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Meir midivreihem lamadnu. From their words we learn. So the Gemara asks, midivreihem dama. Whose words are we talking about when Rabbi Meir comes along and says from their words? Whose words? If you want to say that we are learning from the words of Rabbi Chanina, mi dami, is this really comparable? Meaning, is Rabbi Meir, who uses it to compare the chametz, which is pure and impure, and he compares that now with Rabbi Chanina's statement, which was about different types of meat. So he says they are incomparable. The Gemara says, Hasam tameh v'tameh. Over there, Rabbi Chanina was talking about 2 different types of meats that were tameh. Hacha tahor v'tameh. But over here, we're talking about chametz, which is pure, and chametz, which is impure. So those are not comparable. Therefore, according to this position in the Gemara, that can't be the divreihem, the words that we are talking about. Ve'ela medivrei Rabbi Akiva. So now the only other option that we have at the moment is Rabbi Akiva, who was talking about oil that had been disqualified from a tavul yom, or oil that had been disqualified because of its impurity. So the Gemara asks again, Mi dami, is that comparable? Hasam pasul v'tameh. Over there we were talking about something that had been invalidated and disqualified because of a tavul yom, because of this person awaiting to have his status changed. Hacha, in our case of the chametz, tahor v'tameh. Again, it's the same question. We're not talking about the same kind of parallel topics over here. One is pasul v'tameh, which is disqualification, invalidation, and impurity. And now with the chametz, we're talking about pure and impure. Says the Gemara, Neima kasava Rabbi Meir masnisin ba'av hatula de'oraisa v'vlad hatuma derabanan. So, what we want to entertain at this point is that Rabbi Meir holds the following, that the Mishnah is referring to something which has been contaminated by an Av HaTumah, primary source of Tumah, and that means that it is biblical. And we're dealing with an object which is rabbinic in its impurity nature. Vlad HaTumah, derivative, a lower level source of impurity, is rabbinic in nature, the mid'oraisa tahor ma'aliyah, which would mean that biblically you can have something which is actually pure, but the rabbis added on these extra layers of stringency around items of purity, and they would be considered impure by rabbinic standards. So Rabbi Meir is saying that our Mishnah is referring to two items, okay? Teruma, which is impure biblically, and teruma, which is pure biblically, but it would be impure rabbinically. So when we said before that we're talking about tahor and tameh, we're talking about tahor biblically and tameh biblically, but rabbinically they would actually both be impure rabbinically, right? So that's what we're entertaining is Rabbi Meir's position at the moment, in which case we ask the question at the top of Tesvav, Umay Midivrehem. So what do we then say are the Divrehem, the words that Rabbi Meir is saying that we learn from? Because now he's saying that we can compare the cases. Midivrei Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. In which case we're learning from Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim, who was talking about Tumah and Tumah. He was talking about meat that was impure at a rabbinic level, and meat that was impure at a biblical level. And even though you'd be adding the layers of Tumah, the levels of Tumah, Rabbi Chanina said the Kohanim still burnt them together. So that's how Rabbi Meir is able to resolve this. Amar Reish Lakish Mishum Bar Kapara. Reish Lakish said in the name of Bar Kapara, Masnisin ba'ava Tumah de'oraisa, v'vlad ha-Tumah de'oraisa. Rabbi Reish Lakish in the name of Bar Kapara says that our Mishnah is talking about a primary source, an Av HaTumah de'oraisa, which is biblical, the Vlad HaTumah de'oraisa, and a secondary source of Tumah, which is biblical. In which case, Umay Midivrehim, what was Rabbi Meir referring to when he said from their words? So then he says, Midivrei Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua. So it's actually the words, the statement of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. So now the Gemara asks, well, hey Rabbi Yehoshua, which case, which words, which statement of Rabbi Yehoshua are we talking about that he is now referring to in our Mishnah? It seems to be referring to a case that is not necessarily mentioned in our Mishnah, in which case we need to decipher what that is. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yehoshua, if you want to say that it's the case that Rabbi Yehoshua brought in a different place in Shas, in Becharos, Ditnan, because we have a Mishnah which says, Chavit shel Teruma shenoled lasafek Tuma. So there was a barrel that was filled with Teruma produce, and a suffix, a doubt arose. Perhaps they were concerned that an impure person had touched this barrel, had touched this produce, and now they have a question about whether the teruma is pure or impure. So this doubt has arisen. So the positions were as follows: Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Im hai samim neches b'makom hatorfa, yanichen b'makom hamutzna. So Rabbi Eliezer was very concerned that this barrel may have become tamei, and so he takes very strict measures to protect it. So if it was if the barrel is in an exposed place, let's just scroll down over here. So if it was in an exposed place, then you should put it in a concealed place, in a hidden place. And if it was open, then he should cover it. Rabbi Yehoshua says nothing doing. Rabbi Yehoshua says that if it was placed in a hidden place, in a concealed place, put it in an exposed place. It doesn't matter now if the teruma becomes more contaminated. We don't need to worry. And if it was covered up, then you can open it. So that is where we can now compare it to our Mishnah, because we were saying that you can take chametz which is pure, and you can burn it with chametz which is impure. You don't have to worry about the extra contamination. How do we know? How are we learning that? We're learning it from Rabbi Yehoshua's position in this Mishnah, where he allows doubtful teruma to become potentially more contaminated. But now the Gemara asks, Midami, are these really comparable? Hasam Gurama Ba'alma. Over there, it's just a kind of, you're leaving it, and so there's a potential now that something will happen to it. So it's passive. You're not actually doing anything. Hacha, but in the case of Achametz, Biyadayim, you are actually taking an action to burn these items of Chametz together. So they're not comparable, says the Gemara. Ela ha Rabbi Yehoshua. Rather than, let's go for a second source of Rabbi Yehoshua. Ditnan, Chavis shel Teruma. You've now got a barrel of wine, and the wine is Teruma. It's designated for Kohanim. But Shenishbara Bagasa Elyona. But it has broken in the upper vat, and now it is dripping down. But what's it dripping into? V'tachtona chulin tamein. It's dripping into chulin. It's dripping into wine that is not designated for any sacrificial purpose. It's not designated for kohanim. It's completely unconsecrated normal wine. Trouble is as well, it's tamein. It's impure. So not only is it forbidden to a kohen because it's impure, but it's forbidden even to anybody else because it is impure. So when it was teruma, it was forbidden only to kohanim, and now that it's tameh, it's forbidden to everybody. So even though it is becoming tameh, even though it is adding these extra levels of problem, nonetheless, Mode Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yehoshua, she'im yachol lahatzim mimena be'revi'is b'tahara yatzel. So Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua both agree that if you can save even a revi'is that will keep it pure, then you should save it. V'im lav, and now we have our machlokes, and if you can't save this amount, Rabbi Eliezer omer tered v'titameh v'al yitam'en biyad. He says it's better to let it descend and to become contaminated rather than cause it to become tameh through your actions. Rabbi Yehoshua omer af yitameh biyad. According to Rabbi Yehoshua, though, if you can't salvage this requisite amount, then he says you can even let it become impure on account of your actions. In which case, we're then trying to use that as our comparison to our chametz. Ihachi, if that's the case, hi midivreihem. The Mishnah said midivreihem, from their words. But the Gemara asks midvarav mebayle. This is only Rabbi Yehoshua's opinion. So it should have just said, from his words does Rabbi Meir draw this comparison. Hachika Amar, this is what it's trying to say. Mi machlukason shel Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Yehoshua lamad. It's saying that from the machlokes of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, that is where we learn this comparison. And dikalami, and we can infer this with the actual words that we read in our Mishnah, dikatani, because it teaches Mode Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Yehoshua that they're agreeing, right? So we had, first of all, in our Mishnah, we had Rabbi Chanina talking about meat, then we had Rabbi Akiva talking about the oil, and then we had Rabbi Meir saying, from their words, we learn that this would apply for chametz, which is pure and impure. And then the very next thing that we say is, Umodin Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. And they agree. Well, where has that come from? If not for the fact that the opinion of Rabbi Meir is referring to a conversation between Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer, and that is what the Mishnah refers to when it says that they are agreeing, and then the Gemara says, yes, Shmamina, indeed we can learn from that this is the correct interpretation of Rabbi Meir's statement, that he is drawing on a machlokes between Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer, and that is where he is learning the comparison, therefore, to being able to apply it to chametz. V'chein amar Rabbi Nachman amar Rabba bar Avuha, and so too Rabbi Nachman quoting Rabba bar Avuha, Masnisin ba'ava tuma d'oraisa, v'vlad hatuma d'oraisa. We're talking about where we have a primary source of tuma, which is biblical, we have a derivative source of tumah, which is biblical. Umay midivrehem, and so what is the Mishnah referring to when it says in the Mishnah midivrehem from their words? It means midivrei Rabbi Eliezer v'Rabbi Yehoshua. It means Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. So he is just kind of more concisely saying the exact same point that we have been making. But now the Gemara challenges it. Eisavei Rava la Rav Nachman. But now Rava challenges Rav Nachman. And he says as follows. Amar Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says to Rabbi Meir, Ein hanidon dome l'raya. The inferred conclusion, the point that Rabbi Meir is trying to make about being able to burn different types of chametz, pure and impure, that is not similar to the proof that you are trying to bring. The proof being about the types of meat that we mentioned at the beginning of the Mishnah, Rabbi Chanina. Because when our rabbis testified, what did they testify about? Im al habasar shenitma bevladatuma shesorfin osar im habasar shenitma ba'avatuma zetame v'zetame. So it's a similar kind of question that we're having, but this time it's challenging Rav Nachman as opposed to the beginning of our Gemara, which was challenging in a different way. So we're saying like this: we're saying that if they were testifying about meat that was contaminated as a derivative of tumah, a lower level, and it's being burnt with a higher level of tumah, zetame v'zetame. Well, these are talking about two cases where it is tameh. Imal hashemen shenifsal b'tvul yom. If we're talking about oil that was invalidated by a tavul yom, someone waiting for the end of the day, shemadlikin oso b'ner nitma b'tameh meis, and it's being lit with a candle or being lit with oil that was contaminated by a corpse, zeh pasul v'zeh tameh. So it's a similar challenge again. One's talking about invalidation and tumah, and we're trying to talk about tumah and tahor, tameh and tahor, pure and impure. Af anu modim b'truma shenitmeis bevlad hatuma shesorfin osa im hatruma shenitmeis b'af hatuma. So we are also, let's just scroll down a bit, even we, where is it? We also say that with regards to teruma that became impure by a lower level of tumah, it's a derivative level of tumah. Shesorfen, it's burning with teruma that was contaminated at an av hatumah primary source. Aval heyach nisrof hatuluya imatameya. But how will we burn teruma, which is doubtful, which is in a suspended status because we're not sure if it's impure or not? How can we be burning that with something which is definitely tameh? Shemi yavo Eliyahu v'yitaharena. Maybe one day Eliyahu Hanavi is going to come and he is going to paskin on this oil that it was actually pure, in which case you burnt pure oil with impure oil. So that is the challenge that comes in. And as we turn the page to Amud Beis, to the second side of the page, we encounter another area which we need to try and explain a bit further. Hapigul v'hanosa v'hatame. Something which is pigul, which means that that during a sacrifice, during the sacrificial process, the wrong intentions were applied. The person doing the different parts of the process had the wrong intentions in mind, and he rendered it pigul, which is a status that is given to problematic sacrifices, and you're not allowed to consume it, you're not allowed to eat it, you're not allowed to do anything with it. It's invalidated because of the person having the wrong mindset. So you've got pigul, vahanosar, and you have sacrifices that have been left overnight and haven't yet finished being processed. That's also a problem. They may not be consumed either. So you've got these two disqualified sacrifices, vahatame, and something which is impure as well. So the quote says as follows: Beis Shammai omrim, ein nisrafim ka'achas. They may not be burned together. Why? Because pigul and nosar, they're not impure. They're disqualified. They're unfit for use. So according to Beis Shammai, you can't now burn them with something which is impure because you are now contaminating them further. Beis Hillel omrim nisrafim ka'achas. Beis Hillel says you can burn them together. V'isal kadaitach Rabbi Meir midivrei Rabbi Yoshua ka'amar. And if you want to say that Rabbi Meir is saying that he derives his opinion from Rabbi Yehoshua, Amai Mahada le Rabbi Yossi mid Rabbi Chanina Sagan HaKohanim. Why then does Rabbi Yossi respond to him from the statement of Rabbi Chanina Sagan HaKohanim is in the wrong place? Amalei Rav Nachman says Rabbi Yossi lav adaite. Rabbi Yossi did not understand the position of Rabbi Meir. To who sava Rabbi Meir, because he thought that Rabbi Meir, he thought that Rabbi Meir is saying a proof mid Rabbi Chanina Sagana Kohanim. He thought that Rabbi Meir was saying a proof from the statement of Rabbi Chanina the Sagana Kohanim. Ka'amale. Va'amale, and Rabbi Meir is saying, Ana mid Rabbi Yoshua Ka'amina. And he is saying that I am stating my proof from the statement of Rabbi Yehoshua. Va'amale, and Rabbi Yossi would be saying back, Va'afilu Rabbi Yehoshua nami einahi hamida. And then he would be saying, Rabbi Yossi would be saying, because if you recall, the answer in the Mishnah from Rabbi Yossi is that they are not comparable. So that is why we're explaining now that Rabbi Yossi says it's not comparable. Afilu Rabbi Yehoshua, even according to Rabbi Yehoshua, which Rabbi Meir is saying he is quoting, that is not comparable. To Hamode Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, Shesorach Zubif Neyatzma, the Zubif Neyatzma. Because actually, if you wanted to say, right, Rabbi Meir, who told us that we learn from their words, that you can burn them together, Rabbi Yossi is now saying, no, that's not true, because Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer would say that chametz, which is pure, and chametz, which is impure, and that's teruma, they have to be burnt separately. Va'amai einohi amida. Why are we saying that they're not comparable? Midah midahu. They're most certainly comparable, most certainly legitimate. The Gemara answers, Shani Hasam Dika Hefsed Chulin. The Gemara answers, no, it's actually different over there. Shani Hasam meaning, going back. Oh, you see why it's difficult now. Going back to our broken barrel. So our problem is that Rabbi Yehoshua, who had told us that with the broken barrel you can just let the wine come down. Over there it's different because there is a loss of chulin. Whereas over here, okay, well, what it seems to be saying is, and again, I don't have full understanding, but there we go. It's a short day. The they have to be burned separately. And why are they not comparable? It would seem they're actually extremely comparable. It seems to be a perfectly legitimate comparison. In which case we have to be wondering, how is it in our chametz case, Rabbi Yehoshua says they have to be burnt separately. In the wine case, he says that you can allow the contamination to occur. And the Gemara now answers, Shani Hasam De'ika Hefsed Chulin. Over there, he lets the wine flow through because otherwise you're going to have a loss occur to your chulin. But with regards to the chametz, you're not going to have any loss incurring because it's all got to go anyway because it's Erev Pesach. Maskif la Rabbi Yirmiyah. So we have an objection for Rabbi Yirmiyah. Masnisin nami ikar hefsed de'etzim. But in our Mishnah also, you're going to have a loss of firewood because according to Rabbi Yehoshua, you're going to be saying that you need to have two separate fires burning to be able to burn these two things. So how then can we justify the loss that occurs by having to use more wood? Amalei hahu saba, an elderly person said to him, Lehefsed merubah chashashu, when it comes to the loss due to the chulin, that's a substantial loss. Lehefsed muat, but a minor loss, like having to use more firewood, we're not worried about such things. Amar Rabbi Yassi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yassi said, quoting Rabbi Yochanan, Machlokes b'sheish, the dispute about whether to burn pure and impure terumah, that's only relevant to the 6th hour, where there's still some doubt, where there's still potentially biblically it's permitted to benefit from chametz of al-b'sheva, but in the 7th hour, divrei hakol sorfin. Everyone would agree that if you've still got chametz and it's still not destroyed, and you've got pure chametz and you've got impure chametz, if you're in the 7th hour, everyone will agree to bung it all in together and get it burnt up. Amalei Rabbi Zer le Rabbi Yassi. Rabbi Zer said to Rabbi Yassi, Neima kasav Rabbi Yochanan. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan holds masnisin ba'avatuma de'oraisa v'vlad hatuma de'rabanan. Maybe he's talking about where you have got chametz, which is biblically a primary source of tumah, and rabbinically a derivative, which means that biblically it's pure. Umay midivreihem, and so what's he referring to when he says their words? Midivrei Rabbi Chanina Sgan HaKohanim. He's talking about the words of Rabbi Chanina Sgan HaKohanim. And what he's saying is that in the 6th hour, if you have got biblically pure and biblically impure terumah, chametz, those can be burnt together. Amalei, in, yes, that is the answer. It's Marinami, it was stated also. Let's scroll down. Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Masnisin ba'avatuma de'oraisa. Our mission is referring to chametz, which is biblically a primary source of tumah, and biblically it's impure. V'vlad hatuma, and you've got a derivative, a lower source of impurity, derabanan, which is rabbinically impure. But biblically, it's going to be tahor, it's going to be pure. Umay midivreihem, and so what is the Mishnah referring to when it said midivreihem? From their words, we learn, the answer is midivrei Rabbi Chanina Sgan HaKohanim. We learn from the words of Rabbi Chanina Sgan HaKohanim. Umachlokes b'sheish, and the machlokes then is occurring, is falling within the 6th hour. Of al-b'sheva, in the 7th hour, divrei hakol sorfin. Everybody would agree that you have to burn it. Continues the Gemara. Lema Masayane. We actually have a support for this. Hapigul v'hanos v'atame. When you have items that are pigul, or items that are left over, and you have got items that are tame, and they all need to be burned. Beis Shammai omrim ein nisrafim ka'achas. Beis Shammai says they can't be burnt together. Beis Hillel omrim nisrafim ka'achas. And Beis Hillel say that they can be burned together. So over there, where you've got these 3 categories, all of which would be biblically problematic, and yet Beis Hillel say they can be burnt together. And Rabbi Yossi would be agreeing with that, and yet Rabbi Yossi is the one who's trying to tell us that they're not compatible, they're not comparable. So how could he be maintaining that then? Sha'ani Hasam, it's different over there. It's different over there because we're dealing with something which is rabbinically impure. Where Rabbi Yossi would say that something which is pigul, something which is nosa, something which is left over, these things are going to be rabbinically impure, in which case Rabbi Yossi would agree that they can be burned together with tumah, with something that is tameh. But that is not the case when it comes to our conversation about chametz, which is not impure. It is still pure, and so you shouldn't be allowed to burn them together. Ditnan, as it says in a Mishnah, hapigul v'hanosar, pigul and nosar, mitamin esayadayim. Rabbinically, they can contaminate a person's hands with tumah. But again, as we were saying, but chametz, which is pure, is not impure, and therefore you shouldn't be allowed to burn it. Lema Masaile, we have some support for this as well. for Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. Hapas she'ipsha, if you have bread that has become moldy, v'nifsala mil'echol la'adam, and it is unfit for a person to eat, v'hakelev yachol la'achla, but a dog could eat it, metama tumas ochlin b'kabetza, it can contaminate, it can become contaminated if it's the size of an egg, v'nisrafa im hatamea b'pesach, and it can be burnt with items which are impure on Pesach. Shani hasam da'afra ba'amahu. The difference over there is that in the case of moldy bread, it is as if it is dust, and it is no longer considered food, and that is why it can be burnt up with these impure items. Ihachi maimoda, in which case, if so, the Gemara says that Rabbi Meir is basing his words on a statement by Rabbi Chanina. Why then does the Mishnah tell us modeh, that we then have a conversation happening between Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Eliezer where they're seemingly agreeing about something? What is that even talking about? Why is the Mishnah mentioning an agreement between these two people if they're nothing to do with the conversation? Hachika amale Rabbi Yossi le Rabbi Meir. Here is what Rabbi Yossi is saying to Rabbi Meir. Afilu le Rabbi Yehoshua d'mekel. Even Rabbi Yehoshua, who is lenient, kimekel, when is he lenient? V'tuluya v'tmeya. He is lenient in a situation where you have teruma, where you have food which is potentially impure, and you have teruma, again set aside for kohanim, which is impure. Aval b'tahora v'tmeya no. But when it comes to pure and impure, Rabbi Yehoshua would not be mekel. He would not be lenient. Ihachi amai enahi hamida. If so, why are the words that he comes back with saying, he comes back with these words, Einohi Hamida, they are not comparable, they are not compatible, it's not a good inference. But Midah Mamidahi, the Gemara challenges this and says this is perfectly reasonable. Oh, Rabbi Yirmiyah, Hachababasar, Shanitzma Bamashkin, Shanitmu Mechamas Sheretz. It's actually talking about meat which got contaminated by impure liquids. And the liquid was contaminated by a sheretz, by a primary source of tumah. Va'azda Rabbi Meir l'tameh. It's going in accordance with Rabbi Meir's opinion. It's consistent. Rabbi Yossi l'tameh. And then Rabbi Yossi is also being consistent. Why? Rabbi Meir l'tameh. Rabbi Meir is consistent because he holds the Amar tumas mashkin l'tameh acherim d'Rabbanan. When you have liquids which are impure liquids rabbinically can contaminate other things, and that is why he holds the way that he holds. For Rabbi Yossi l'tameh, Rabbi Yossi says they're not a good comparison because he holds somewhere else the Amar tumas mashkin l'tameh acherim de'oraisa, that liquids can contaminate other things biblically. So they're both being consistent with their own opinions. D'Tanya, as we see in a Baraisa, Safek Mashkin L'Tameh, liquids which are doubtful or uncertain as to whether they are impure, Tameh, they are presumed to be impure. L'Tameh Acherim Tahor, Divrei Rabbi Meir, but to be able to contaminate other things, they would be pure, according to Rabbi Meir. They would not be able to contaminate other things. So to Rabbi Eliezer holds like this. Rabbi Elazar would be consistent with his words. Rabbi Yehuda Omer L'Kol Tameh. And Rabbi Yehuda would say L'Kol Tameh, that the item is impure, even to be able to contaminate other things as well. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon say la'ochlin tamein, they can contaminate food, but l'keilin tahorim, they would not contaminate vessels. So, what that would mean for us is, let's just take a look at this. So, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon are maintaining that liquids contaminate food biblically, and when they are uncertain, they would not contaminate vessels, and therefore what this shows us is that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi argue about whether liquids which are tameh can contaminate other things, in which case they are staying strong to their opinion, and that machlokes is being transplanted into our machlokes in this Mishnah with regards to whether chametz, which is pure, and chametz, which is impure, can be burnt together. That's all for today. If you've understood a fraction of that, shikoyach, and I guess we'll just have to tune in for more Daf Yomi insights, or see how the argument progresses in tomorrow's Daf on page 16. But for now, that's all for us for today. Wish you a wonderful, meaningful day. And again, very tricky stuff over here. We've tried to do what we can. Further research is required. But in the meantime, have a wonderful and meaningful day.